Welcome to Bedtime Tales, where stories don't just help you sleep, they help you feel. I'm Tomas, and tonight I'll be reading a story about love, loss, and the quiet power of rediscovering yourself. The sky sees everything, follows Grace, a devoted wife who gave her life to her family, only to be left behind when her husband chased something new. But instead of falling apart, she begins to rebuild. Not loudly, not dramatically, but stitch by stitch, breath by breath. Can someone truly find peace after being left behind? Can a one who leaves ever find what they're searching for? And is it possible that the sky sees what we've forgotten to see in each other and in ourselves? Settle in. This story won't ask for your attention. It will earn it. The stillness of autumn, in the quiet town of Maplewood, Oregon, where maple trees burned red every October and chimneys whispered smoke into the sky, the Thompson house stood still. A modest two-story wooden home, painted white long ago and now faded by years of wind and sun, nestled itself beside Maple Drive under a canopy of rustling golden leaves. Inside, Grace Thompson stood by the kitchen window, her slender fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, but a few strands curled over her soft, lined cheeks. Her gaze was fixed on the empty street beyond the lawn, where fallen leaves danced gently in the morning breeze. It was the kind of autumn that a younger Grace might have loved, the kind with spice-scented air and the promise of pumpkin pies cooling on windowsills. But now it felt quiet, too quiet. Thomas Thompson, her husband of nearly 4 decades, sat in the living room recliner. He was dressed, as usual, in a crisp white shirt and neatly pressed khaki trousers. His silver hair was combed with care, and he had a leather-bound poetry book resting on his lap, the same kind he always bought from the dusty corner bookstore downtown. His lips moved soundlessly, reciting verses only he could hear. Grace stirred the pot of chicken soup simmering on the stove. The aroma filled the small kitchen, mingling with the warm scent of freshly baked biscuits. She carefully ladled the soup into 2 ceramic bowls, added a sprinkle of parsley, and placed them gently on the old oak table by the window. The placemats were crocheted. She'd made them herself years ago, back when her hands didn't ache as much and Thomas still complimented her cooking. "Breakfast's ready," she said softly, almost out of habit. Thomas looked up, offered a small nod, then placed his book upside down on the armrest and walked to the table. He sat down with a kind of tiredness that wasn't from age, but from something else. Something colder, quieter, harder to name. Grace took her seat opposite him. She didn't look at him directly. Instead, her eyes followed a squirrel darting across the lawn, then trailed back to the yellow leaves fluttering down from the branches. She remembered when this table was surrounded by laughter. Emma's high voice, Daniel's jokes, Thomas's occasional chuckle. Now, only silence filled the spaces. Thomas sipped his soup without comment. No compliment, no complaint, just silence. Grace had gotten used to the silence, but it didn't mean it didn't hurt. Later that afternoon, Grace pulled her bicycle from the side porch and pedaled toward the local farmer's market. The wire basket in front was lined with a green checker cloth. She bought fresh carrots, some rosemary, and a bouquet of wild chrysanthemums to place on the kitchen table. When she returned, Thomas was gone. His poetry book lay open on the sofa, and a folded piece of paper rested on top. It read, "Meeting the poetry group at Maple Moon." Maple Moon was a quiet cafe at the edge of Main Street, famous for its soft jazz, cinnamon rolls, and wooden shelves lined with used books. Locals often gathered there for poetry readings or late-night music. Grace had been there a few times, but Thomas had taken a particular liking to it since his retirement. Recently, he'd started going more frequently and coming home later. That evening, as Thomas walked through the front door, Grace noticed something different. Not in the way he moved. His steps were the same, slightly slow but steady. No, it was the scent, a soft, floral perfume, delicate, expensive, not one she wore, and certainly not one that clung to books or coffee shops. She turned from the stove as he entered. "Did you eat?" she asked, voice calm. "Yeah, had something at the cafe," he replied, shrugging off his jacket and tossing it onto the arm of the couch. She nodded and turned back to her cooking. She didn't ask more. That wasn't her way. She had never been the prying kind. Even in the early years when Thomas was finishing his degree and often came home late from the library, she never questioned him. Not because she didn't wonder, but because she believed in him, in their marriage, in loyalty. Tonight, that perfume made belief harder. Emma visited that weekend. She arrived around noon, her young son tugging at her coat as she carried a paper bag filled with fresh apple pie and children's books. Emma worked at the town library. She was sharp, warm, and observant, more than Thomas gave her credit for. Grace welcomed her with a smile, kissed her grandson, and poured tea into 2 mismatched floral cups. They sat in the sunlit kitchen, the scent of cinnamon filling the room. "How's Dad?" Emma asked, taking a small sip. Grace hesitated. "Busy. He's been going to the poetry cafe more often. Says it helps him stay inspired." Emma's brow furrowed. "He's gone quite a bit lately. You okay, Mom?" Grace smiled gently. "I'm fine. At our age, people crave space sometimes. He's earned his peace." Emma looked at her mother carefully. There was something behind that smile, an old sadness like a song long forgotten but still hummed under the breath. She wanted to ask more. She didn't. That night, the house settled into its usual hush. Grace sat by the window with her knitting, her fingers slowly weaving a scarf for her grandson. Thomas sat in the living room, flipping through a notebook filled with scribbled verses, some his, some copied from younger poets he'd recently met. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over his chair. The clock ticked in steady rhythm. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves. When Grace finally went to bed, Thomas was already lying down, turned away from her, breathing deep and even. She lay on her side, staring at the ceiling. The bed between them felt colder than it used to. The space they once filled with laughter and whispered dreams now only echoed the sound of their own thoughts. Grace remembered the winter nights of their youth, when they had only one thick blanket, one space heater, and each other to keep warm. They used to talk until they fell asleep, fingers entwined beneath the covers. Now, even with central heating and the best sheets they could afford, she felt like ice. Thomas was there, but he wasn't. And in her heart, she feared maybe he never would be again. The whisper in the leaves. Sunday mornings in Maplewood had a hush about them. The kind of silence that lingered in the golden air and beneath the layers of fallen maple leaves. The town moved slowly, as though holding its breath in reverence to the change of seasons. Grace Thompson rose early. She drew back the curtains in the kitchen, letting in the cool October light that streamed through the window panes in soft ribbons. Her hands moved with quiet familiarity as she filled the kettle, lit the stove, and prepared a small pot of chamomile tea. Thomas was still asleep. He had come home late again the night before. Grace had heard the key in the lock just past midnight, heard the shuffle of his shoes as he entered the house without a word. The scent of unfamiliar perfume still clung faintly to his coat. Sweet. Powdery. Definitely not her kind. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't need to. After preparing breakfast, Grace slipped outside into the backyard. The rose bushes were fading with the cold, but a few final blooms still clung to life, blush pink and soft as memories. She snipped 3 stems and brought them into the house, arranging them in a blue ceramic vase that had once been a Christmas gift from Thomas years ago. Those days, filled with poetry, late-night cocoa, and kisses by the fireplace, felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Emma returned that afternoon with her son. The little boy darted through the yard chasing falling leaves while Emma stayed behind in the kitchen, helping her mother sort through the spice rack and reorganize the cabinets. They worked in silence at first, until Emma finally said, "Mom, I saw Dad last week. At Maple Moon." Grace stopped mid-wipe, her cloth frozen on the glass door of the cabinet. "He goes there often," she said softly. "It's where his poetry group meets." "I know," Emma continued, her voice more hesitant now. "But he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him. She looked younger, maybe late 30s, auburn hair, cream-colored sweater. They looked close." Grace set the cloth down slowly. She didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was low, steady. "I know," she said. "I haven't asked. I won't. Maybe when people get older, they look for something that makes them feel alive again. I don't blame him for needing that. But I can see it. I see it in his eyes. He's no longer here. Not really." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand gently. "Mom, you don't have to carry this alone. You should know what he's doing, how it's hurting you." Grace offered a faint smile. Some wounds aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be survived. That evening, after Emma and the child had gone home, Grace sat in her usual chair by the window, embroidering a tablecloth for the women's group at church. Tiny lavender blossoms stretched across the fabric, their petals stitched with care and aching patience. Behind her, she heard Thomas enter the room. His footsteps were deliberate. He paused near the hallway. "I'm going to Portland tomorrow," he said. "There's a poetry conference. I'll be gone a couple of days." Grace didn't turn around. "When will you be back?" "Maybe Wednesday." "I'm not sure. I'll pack you some oat biscuits," she said. "They help your stomach when you travel." "No need," he replied. "Someone else is taking care of that." Grace stopped stitching. Her hands lowered into her lap. Still, she didn't turn to face him. "Then I won't trouble myself," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke, soft but stinging. Thomas stood there for a moment, as if weighing whether to say something else. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't see the way Grace's shoulders fell. He didn't hear the breath she held at her chest. The next morning, Emma made a phone call. Daniel picked up from Seattle. "Have you noticed anything strange with Dad lately?" she asked. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "He's been distant, Replies to my texts like he's got no time. And Mom? She always says she's fine, but her voice says otherwise. Emma hesitated. I saw him last week with another woman. At Maple Moon. They looked more than friends. I don't know what to do. I don't want to attack him. But I can't watch Mom pretend like everything's okay. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm coming down this weekend. Meanwhile, across town, inside the cozy corners of Maple Moon Cafe, Thomas sat by the window with Lana Mitchell, the woman with the auburn hair and inviting eyes. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sparkled like wine in crystal glasses. She listened intently as Thomas read a new poem. You really have a gift, she said, touching his hand lightly. Not many men are still this passionate about words. About beauty. Thomas smiled. It was a different kind of smile, tinted with embarrassment but also pride. Lana made him feel like someone again, like a man with something to offer, not just a husband in the background of someone else's story. He didn't think about Grace's hands stitching alone by the window. He didn't think about the soup she made or the biscuits she packed in secret. He didn't want to. Daniel arrived Friday night. He hugged Grace tightly, and though she smiled, he could feel the weariness in her arms. He looked around the house. It was spotless, as always, but the warmth had faded, like a photo left in sunlight too long. In the kitchen, as they poured tea, Daniel asked gently, Is Dad seeing someone else? Grace didn't answer at first. Then she nodded. And what will you do? I don't know, she said. For a long time, I believed that keeping the family together was the highest form of love. But now, I'm not sure anymore. Maybe letting things fall apart is the only way to see what was real. Daniel wrapped his arms around her. You don't deserve this, Mom. She didn't respond, but in her silence, there was strength. That evening, after dinner, Emma suggested something unexpected. I want us all to go away for a few days, she said. Just the family. One last trip before the holidays. You, me, Daniel, Dad, and the little one. We can rent the old cabin at Crescent Lake. Remember? From when I was a kid. Thomas looked surprised. I don't know. I might be busy. I already booked it, Emma replied firmly. 3 days. It's been years. I think we need this. Grace didn't say a word. She only nodded slightly as she cleared the dishes. Inside, she knew this might be the last time they'd ever sit at the same table again. The wind outside was whispering through the trees, and in its quiet voice, it carried all the things left unsaid. The woman in red. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he felt this alive. He stood outside the Maple Moon Cafe that Friday evening, adjusting the collar of his coat. Through the glass, warm golden lights flickered, casting soft reflections over Lana's figure. She was already there, waiting by their usual table near the fireplace, her hands wrapped around a tall mug of chai latte. She wore a deep red coat tonight, fitted elegant, and striking against her auburn hair. She always wore red, sometimes in her lipstick, sometimes in her scarf. It was subtle but intentional, and Thomas, though he never said it, noticed every time. As he stepped inside, the scent of cinnamon, books, and coffee wrapped around him like a blanket. Lana looked up and smiled, that same knowing smile that had slowly begun to unravel everything he thought he'd known about himself. You're late, she teased. Traffic, he replied with a gentle grin. Or maybe I just didn't want this to start because then it'll have to end. Lana raised her eyebrows. That's quite a poetic way to dodge responsibility. Occupational hazard, he chuckled. She laughed softly, and they fell into their usual rhythm. Wine and poetry, quiet glances, two long pauses. It was a dance that both knew by now. Later that evening, after they walked to her car under a sky filled with drifting clouds, Lana leaned against the door, watching him. "I'm thinking of moving," she said suddenly. Thomas blinked. "Moving? Out of town? Maybe Portland. Maybe Seattle. I don't know. This place is getting small." Thomas's stomach twisted slightly. "You've never mentioned that before." "I haven't made up my mind," she said. "But if I do, I want someone to come with me." The implication sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Thomas looked down at the pavement. "That's a big decision." Lana tilted her head. "You don't owe me anything, Thomas. I'm not here to break things, but I need to know if this is something real for you, or if I'm just your poetic distraction." He didn't answer. Not yet, because in truth, he didn't know. Lana represented everything Thomas felt he'd lost: adventure, excitement, admiration. But beneath the thrill was something else. A quiet guilt, a fading echo of Grace's voice calling him home every evening for decades. "I'll think about it," he finally said. She smiled again. "That's all I ask." And then she kissed him, brief but deep, as the wind lifted her red coat like a flag in retreat. Meanwhile, back at the Thompson house, Grace sat alone at the dining table, a single bowl of stew growing cold in front of her. She had stopped waiting for him to call when he'd be late. She had stopped texting. She no longer set out 2 plates. But tonight, something shifted. She stood up, walked into the bedroom, and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were memories, scrapbooks, old birthday cards, faded photographs, and letters. She pulled out a picture from their 20th anniversary. Thomas in a gray suit, Grace in a blue dress, smiling under a string of garden lights. There was laughter in their eyes then. Youth. A sense of forever. She held the photo in her hand for a long time. Then she carefully slid it into a drawer and shut the lid. Some things weren't meant to be relived. Some things had already said goodbye. The next day, Daniel joined Emma for coffee in town. They sat on a bench across from the library, bundled in scarves, watching people walk dogs and drink from steaming paper cups. "He's not even hiding it anymore," Daniel said bitterly. "She wears red like she wants everyone to see her." Emma stirred her tea. "And Mom just takes it. She's not weak," Daniel snapped. "She's grieving something that's still standing in front of her." Emma nodded slowly. "We need to support her. Not push. Just be there." They agreed to keep their plan for the family trip. One last try. One last chance to reach him, or at least help their mother heal. That evening, Thomas came home early. Grace was in the garden, trimming the rose bushes with gentle precision. The late autumn sun spilled over her silver hair, making it glow like winter frost. Thomas stood at the back door watching her. For the first time in weeks, he didn't walk away. "I saw Daniel today," he said quietly. Grace didn't turn around. "He told me he was visiting. He's worried. He has a right to be." Thomas hesitated. "Emma's planning a trip. Crescent Lake. Like when the kids were little." "I know. You want to go?" Grace set the pruning shears down. Finally, she turned to face him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was still. "I'll go," she said, "but not for you." And with that, She picked up the roses and walked past him into the house. Thomas stood alone in the fading light. Inside him, something rustled, soft as a whisper in the leaves. A question he didn't yet know how to answer, and a fear that maybe the woman in red wasn't the one worth holding on to after all. The fracture, the storm had been brewing for weeks, maybe months. It gathered in glances not exchanged, in words not spoken, in the quiet tension that filled the Thompson house like invisible fog. And then, one Sunday afternoon, the silence finally shattered. Emma arrived with her son just after noon. Grace was setting the table, roast chicken, potatoes, a warm apple cobbler in the oven. She didn't cook like this often anymore, but something in her stirred today, some old instinct to hold the family together with food and familiarity. Daniel pulled into the driveway shortly after. He stepped out of his car with a duffel bag and an expression far more serious than usual. Thomas was already home. He'd returned from another conference the night before, but this time, he'd brought something back with him that couldn't be hidden: distance. It hung on him like a second coat. As the family gathered around the table, conversation stayed light. Emma talked about work. Daniel told a story about getting lost on a hiking trail. Kraktes milet, notet, pouretea. Thomas sat mostly silent, staring at his plate. Then Emma put down her fork. "Dad," she said calmly, "can we talk?" The room froze. Even the little boy sensed the shift and stopped playing with his mashed potatoes. Thomas looked up slowly. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Emma glanced at Daniel, then back at her father. "I saw you with her. At Maple Moon. More than once. And I know she's not just part of Poetry Club." Grace kept her eyes on her hands, folded gently in her lap. Thomas's face flushed. "Emma, that's not." "Please," she interrupted, "don't insult our intelligence." Daniel leaned forward. "We're not here to judge you. We just want honesty. For Mom. For all of us." Thomas stood up, pushing his chair back. "This is none of your business. What happens between your mother and me is." "It is our business," Emma snapped. "Because we've watched Mom shrink while you disappear into someone else's compliments." "Enough." Thomas's voice thundered across the table. The boy flinched. Grace finally looked up, her face calm, her eyes glassy but unbroken. "Don't raise your voice," she said softly. "Not here. Not in front of your grandson." Thomas inhaled sharply and sat back down. Silence followed. Thick, suffocating. Emma stood up. "I'm taking Oliver outside. He doesn't need to hear this." She took the child by the hand and stepped into the backyard, leaving Daniel and Grace inside with Thomas. Daniel leaned back, arms folded. "So, what is she to you, Dad?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Someone who listens, who doesn't see me as a piece of furniture." Grace didn't flinch. She didn't react. She only nodded. "I see," she said. Thomas looked at her. "Grace!" "No," she said, her voice even. "You don't have to explain. I think I understand now." Daniel's voice was cold. "You're going to throw away 40 years for a few afternoons of admiration?" Thomas shook his head, angry and ashamed. "It's not that simple. But it never is it?" Daniel stood up. "We came here thinking maybe you'd still fight for what matters. Guess we were wrong." He walked out of the room without another word. Thomas sat alone, staring at the table, at the empty chair where Grace had been. She stood slowly, cleared a few dishes, and turned to him. "Whatever you're looking for, I hope it gives you peace," she said. and then she left the room. Out in the backyard, Emma sat on the porch steps, her son curled against her side, play with a toy car. Grace joined her after a few minutes. They didn't speak for a while. Just watched the golden leaves fall one by one. "I'm sorry, Mom," Emma said finally. Grace shook her head. "You didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to protect you." "You did," Grace said. "By being here. That's all I've ever needed." Emma blinked back tears. "Are you going to leave him?" Grace took a long breath. "I don't know. I've spent most of my life holding this family together. I never thought I'd have to decide whether to walk away from it." Emma nodded. "Whatever you decide, I'll be here. So will Daniel." Grace smiled faintly. "I know." Inside, Thomas sat in the living room. Alone, he stared at the framed photograph on the wall. Him and Grace, their wedding day, all sunlight and youth. He remembered the vows, the soft way she had whispered, "I do." He thought of Lana, her laughter, her youth, her freedom. He thought of Grace, who never demanded, who never shouted, who simply loved him and let him choose. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure if what he'd chosen was love or just escape. That night, after dinner dishes were put away and Emma and Daniel had gone, Thomas walked into the bedroom. Grace was sitting at her vanity, brushing her hair. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him through the mirror. "I believe you," she replied. But belief, she knew now, wasn't the same as trust. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees with a sound like bones shifting beneath skin. Something had broken, and it wasn't going to be easy to mend. Letters never sent. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Not the comforting quiet that came from peace, but the kind that felt hollow. Every corner of the Thompson home seemed to echo now. Every sound lingered just a little longer than it should have. After Sunday's confrontation, Thomas barely spoke. He spent most of his time in the garden shed or took long walks through the neighborhood. Grace didn't ask where he went. She didn't ask anything anymore. That week, a heavy fog rolled over Maplewood, draping the town in pale gray. The streets were silent, leaves matted wet to the pavement, and the air smelled of earth and endings. Inside the house, Grace kept herself busy. She swept, baked, folded laundry, reorganized the bookshelves. She crocheted scarves for the church fundraiser and brought soup to the elderly widow down the street. To anyone else, she might have looked fine, even cheerful, but each night, after she turned off the porch light and closed the curtains, she would sit by the kitchen table and take out a worn leather notebook. It was filled with pages of cursive writing, faded ink, and corners curled with time. Letters, not sent, not even addressed, just written. They began in the early years of their marriage. Little notes to Thomas she never gave him. At first, they were love letters, full of joy, gratitude, dreams. "You look so handsome in your gray suit today. I'm proud to be beside you. Thank you for washing the dishes tonight. I noticed. I love the way you hum when you read." As the years went on, the tone shifted. "You've been distant lately. I miss the way we used to talk. I wish you'd look at me the way you look at your books. Some days, I feel like a ghost in my own home." Now, her latest letters were written in silence, under a dim kitchen light while the clock ticked away toward midnight. She didn't write out of hope anymore. She wrote because it was the only way to hear herself. One morning, Grace stood in front of her closet, holding a deep green dress she hadn't worn in years. She brushed the dust off the sleeves, and ran her fingers across the stitching. She remembered wearing it to a wedding once. Thomas had said she looked like spring. She put it back on the hanger, and she took it off again. Downstairs, she placed a call to the church office. "Is the Thursday group for widows and single women still meeting?" she asked. "Yes," the receptionist replied. "You're always welcome to join." Grace hung up, then sat still for a long time. The group wasn't for her, at least not technically, but something inside her felt closer to them now than to any room she shared with Thomas. That night, Thomas came home later than usual. His face looked tired, older than even a week ago. Grace was sitting at the kitchen table, knitting. He sat down across from her. "I saw Lana today," he said. Grace didn't look up. "Did you?" "She wants me to move with her. To Seattle." Grace paused mid-stitch, then resumed. "Are you going?" Thomas hesitated. "I told her I wasn't sure." Grace nodded. "That sounds about right." He winced, but didn't argue. "She thinks I'm still the man I used to be," he said after a moment. Grace looked up finally. Her eyes were calm, steady. "You're not," she said simply. The words stung, but they were true. Thomas leaned back, rubbing his temples. "When did I become this person?" Grace set her knitting aside. "When you stopped writing poems for yourself," she said. "When you started performing instead of feeling." They sat in silence again. Thomas reached for the notebook on the shelf nearby, the one where he once scribbled verses every morning. He opened it. Blank pages stared back at him. Later that week, Thomas entered the attic for the first time in years. Dust blanketed everything. Old Christmas decorations, worn suitcases, forgotten boxes. He opened one labeled G&T, early years. Inside were photo albums, souvenirs, postcard from road trips, little keepsakes. A hotel key card from their 10th anniversary. A menu from a diner where they'd laughed until they cried. A dried flower from their first home garden. He sat on the floor and flipped through the photos. Grace in her 20s, hair loose, smiling at him behind a slice of lemon pie. Him standing by the lake, holding her hand. The man in those pictures looked free. So did the woman. Thomas shut the box slowly, hands trembling. Downstairs, he found Grace folding laundry. "I've made mistakes," he said. She didn't stop folding. "So have I," she replied. "I thought chasing something new would make me feel young again. But it didn't. It just made me feel hollow." Grace looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to know I know." She gave a soft sigh. "There's a difference between regret and change," she said. And with that, she picked up the laundry basket and left the room. On Friday, Emma called. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm breathing." Grace said, "That's a start." Emma hesitated. "We're still going to Crescent Lake, right?" "Yes," Grace said. "We need it. All of us. Even Dad." Grace was quiet. Then even Dad. That night, Grace wrote another letter. She wrote about silence, about what it felt like to vanish in plain sight, about what it cost a woman to always be strong. And then, for the first time, she signed it. "I will not disappear for anyone anymore. Grace." She didn't place it in the notebook. She placed it on Thomas's pillow. He found it hours later, after she had already gone to bed. He sat on the edge of the bed, letter in hand, staring at her sleeping figure. She looked peaceful, not because she had forgiven him, but because she had finally forgiven herself for staying too long, for hoping too hard, and perhaps now for beginning to let go. Outside, the fog began to lift. Slowly, carefully. And somewhere beneath the weight of guilt and memory, the wind stirred. The hollow house. The day Thomas left the White House on Maple Drive, the sky was still. No wind, no rain, just a quiet, gray morning in Maplewood. The kind of morning that felt too calm to belong to something breaking apart. Grace didn't come to the door. She remained in the kitchen, wiping the dining table a final time. Even though it was already clean, her hands moved automatically calmly. She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to stay. She had nothing left to plead with. Thomas rolled his suitcase across the porch steps. The wheels clicked hollowly against the wood. He paused by the front gate and turned back for a moment. Staring at the door he had walked through thousands of times, after work, after church, after long drives home. A door Grace once stood at, apron on, lips curved in a smile, always waiting. Now it was closed. No one waited. Thomas moved into a small apartment on the edge of Seattle with Lana. It was modern, 2 bedrooms, minimalist furniture, a balcony overlooking a man-made pond, and freshly painted walls that smelled nothing like home. Lana beamed when she showed him the place. "I want everything here to be new," she had said. "I don't carry pieces of the past." Thomas smiled and nodded. At first it was thrilling. They made coffee together, picked out curtain colors, shared Spotify playlists, and read poetry over wine. Lana laughed often, called him my brilliant poet, and sometimes wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, whispering, "You're all I need." Thomas wanted to believe that, and for a while he did. But moments are not a life. By the 3rd week, things began to shift. Lana started talking about money. "I need a new car," she said one morning, casually. "Something hybrid and sleek." Later that week, she asked, "Could you access that piece of land you own in Maplewood? If we sold it, we could open a little art studio, your poems, my paintings." A dream. Thomas didn't respond. He watched as the apartment began to feel colder, despite its sleek design. There were no books with cracked spines. No chamomile tea in the cupboard. No clinking knitting needles or soft gospel records humming from the kitchen. Just abstract art, unpaid credit card bills, and a couch that looked beautiful but offered no comfort. Lana started staying out late. Gallery openings, yoga classes, dinners with friends. She came home smelling like wine and perfume, kissed him quickly, and disappeared into the bathroom. Thomas often found himself alone on the balcony, staring at the artificial pond below. The water never changed. There were no falling leaves, no sound of children laughing, no history in its ripples. One night, unable to sleep, Thomas opened his laptop and logged into the joint account he had once used with Grace. The balance was lower than he remembered. He scrolled down. A large withdrawal. Recently made. He texted Lana. No reply. 3 hours later, she returned. Red lipstick smudged, dress elegant, heels in hand. "Where were you?" he asked. "Out. A friend's exhibit," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You took money from the savings," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. "I borrowed it," she shrugged. "I'll pay it back." That was money Grace and I saved for house repairs. And for Emma's maternity leave. Lana's tone turned icy. "So we're back to them again? I thought you wanted a new life, Thomas. Not drag your suburban ghost stories into my world." He stared at her, the woman in red, once vibrant, now sharp around the edges. He didn't say another word. Back in Maplewood, Grace's life was beginning again, gently, slowly, like spring after a brutal winter. She joined the Thursday women's group at the church. She baked pies, knitted scarves, and helped prepare care packages for local shelters. She invited friends over for tea and let herself laugh again at little things like a crooked batch of cookies or a song she hadn't heard in years. She started writing again, not just letters to Thomas, but entries for herself, quiet reflections, small joys, honest fears. She no longer wrote hoping someone else would read them. Now she wrote to listen to her own voice. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel like someone's wife or someone's mother. She felt like Grace, and that, she thought, might be enough. Emma called regularly. During one conversation, she said, "You sound lighter, Mom." Grace smiled. "Maybe because I've stopped trying to hold everything up. You'd be surprised how much easier it is to breathe when you're not keeping the world from falling apart." Daniel sent a letter. It arrived with a photo of Grace and her grandkids at the park. "You're teaching us how to be whole," he wrote. "Not by saving a marriage, but by saving yourself." She folded the letter and tucked it into her journal. One early morning, Thomas called. Grace saw his name flash on the screen, T. She hesitated, then picked up. "How are you?" she asked. "Not great," he said, voice ragged. "I miss the house." Grace was quiet. "The house is still there, but you're not." He swallowed. "Do you hate me?" "No," she answered softly, "but I'm no longer waiting for you." There was a pause. "I hope you're okay," he said finally. "I am," she replied. "For the first time, I really am." That evening, she watered the plants on the porch. The light from the kitchen spilled onto the steps, warm and golden. Her silver hair shimmered under the soft glow. She hummed an old song, one she couldn't quite name, and smiled without knowing why. Inside, the dining table held a single bowl of soup, a single teacup, but the house didn't feel empty anymore, because the woman sitting at that table was full of courage, of clarity, of herself. Threads of light. Autumn in Maplewood was never just a season. It was a painter leaving strokes of amber, crimson, and gold on every surface. The town glowed under the gentle light of late October. Porch swings creaked softly in the wind. Children played in leaf piles. And in a small house on Maple Drive, Grace Thompson found herself waking up not just to the day, but to her own quiet rebirth. She no longer waited for the past to return. Instead, she welcomed each morning like an unfinished poem. The house still creaked the same way it had for decades. And yet everything inside it felt different. Grace had rearranged the living room. She donated old photo frames and clear drawers filled with broken chargers and obsolete receipts. The kitchen felt brighter now, not because of new paint, but because it finally belonged to her and only her. Her mornings were slow and deliberate. She sat by the window with her tea, watching sunlight stretch across the hardwood floor. Then she'd open her journal, pages no longer filled with unsent letters to Thomas, but with reflections, prayers, gratitude lists, and even the occasional memory that no longer stung. One morning, she wrote, "I once thought that being alone would mean being empty, but it turns out it just meant there was finally space for myself." She smiled at that line. It wasn't profound, but it was hers. Grace began attending the Thursday women's group every week without fail. A dozen or so women of all ages gathered in the old basement of the town's church. Some were widowed, some divorced, others never married. They sat in a circle, knitting, baking, sharing updates from their gardens or their grandkids. The room smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and worn wool. But more than that, it smelled like healing. Grace brought her embroidery hoop each time. Her hands stitched flowers and vines into the fabric. Each thread a line of poetry she no longer needed to speak aloud. "You're so patient, Susan," one of the older women told her. "I've never seen someone stitch like that without shaking." Grace smiled. "Maybe I shake too much inside to let it out on the outside." Everyone laughed. Not at her, with her. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt part of something, not because she had to be, but because she chose to be. In early November, the group began preparing for the Winter Kindness Market, a community event where handmade goods and baked treats would be sold to raise money for struggling families in the area. Grace signed up to help lead the booth. She spent her evenings sewing cloth ornaments, embroidering bookmarks, and baking spiced bread loaves. Her kitchen was filled with scents of ginger and cardamom. The radio played soft jazz as she moved between flour and thread. Sometimes she caught herself humming again. One night, as she carefully wrapped a batch of orange clove cookies in parchment, she paused, looked around the quiet kitchen, and whispered, "I'm happy." And it was true. Not the ecstatic kind of happiness she'd once chased, but the kind that settled into your bones like warmth from a fire you built with your own hands. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Thomas sat on the edge of the balcony, staring out at the artificial pond below. The trees were bare now. The concrete was slick with rain. Lana had left 2 days earlier for an artist retreat in mountains. She didn't say when she'd be back, or if she would. The apartment was cold. He hadn't cooked in a week. A pile of dishes sat in the sink. He hadn't written a word. He pulled out his old notebook, the one that used to hold verses and sonnets scribbled with ink stains and passion. The pages remained blank. Thomas missed the smell of Grace's soup, the scratchy sound of her needle and thread, the way she left the porch light on, even if he came home late, the smell of lavender on her pillow. He missed being known, not just admired. And worse, he began to realize that what he had mistaken for freedom was only loneliness in disguise. The Winter Kindness Market arrived on a snowy Saturday morning. The church courtyard was lined with string lights, folding tables, and colorful scarves swaying gently in the breeze. People sipped cider from paper cups, and children ran from booth to booth, their mittens full of cookies and small hand-carved toys. Grace stood at her booth, surrounded by her homemade crafts. Her table was simple, but it drew people in. Embroidered bookmarks with quotes of hope. Tiny ornaments shaped like houses and hearts. Loaves of bread wrapped in red ribbon. A handwritten sign read, "Made with quiet hands and loud love." Customers smiled. Some recognized her. A few asked how she'd been. "I'm new," she answered with a twinkle. Susan came over and nudged her. "You're glowing." "I'm just standing in the light," Grace replied. That afternoon, Emma and Daniel arrived. They hugged their mother, admired her work, and helped restock the table. The three of them laughed together, deep belly laughs that came from somewhere real. It was then Grace realized this wasn't just her new life. This was her life. Period. That evening, after the market closed and the booths were packed away, Grace walked home in the soft hush of falling snow. Her boots left steady tracks behind her. The sky was deep blue, stars peeking through the clouds. She stepped inside her warm house, unwrapped her scarf, and lit the small lamp on the side table. Everything was still. Everything was full. She sat down, picked up her journal, and wrote. I once believed that light came from others, but it turns out I was always holding a thread of it inside me. She closed the book, then she smiled into the quiet. Cracks in the dream. The apartment had grown quiet. Too quiet. Thomas sat at the dining table, the untouched remnants of his dinner still warm in their plastic containers. The glow of the city filtered in through the balcony doors, a dull orange haze that made everything feel unreal, like he was watching his own life from the outside. It had been 2 weeks since Lana had gone to her artist retreat. She hadn't called, hadn't messaged. The last text he'd received read, I need space. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk. That was 10 days ago. At first, he told himself this was just her process. She was a free spirit. She needed room to breathe. That's what he had liked about her, wasn't it? That unpredictability, that energy. But now the silence stretched too long, and the dream he had clung to, the illusion of renewal, the rush of feeling young again, was cracking at the edges. One afternoon, Thomas visited a cafe near Pike Place Market, hoping the bustling crowd and smell of roasted coffee might stir something in him. He sat with a notebook open in front of him, the pages blank. A pen rested between his fingers. He stared out the window. Across the street, an older couple walked hand in hand, their coats matching, their pace slow but steady. The man said something, and the woman laughed, touching his arm with easy affection. Thomas blinked, and his eyes stung. He thought of Grace, of how she used to reach for his hand during long car rides, how she still packed extra napkins for his lunch, even when he told her not to fuss, how she had made him a scarf last Christmas, even though he had barely acknowledged it. She was the kind of woman who stayed, and he had left her for a firework that flared bright and disappeared in the smoke. That night, he received a phone call. Lana. His heart jumped when he saw her name. He answered immediately. Hey, he said, trying to sound calm. Hi, she replied. Her voice was distant. I'm not coming back. The words struck him like ice water down the spine. I don't understand, he said. I thought I could do this. I thought maybe we could build something, she said. But I'm not looking for a husband, Thomas. I'm looking for a partner who can keep up with the life I want. And you're still halfway living in your old world. He was silent. I'm sorry, she added, but I'm done. The line went dead. Thomas sat there for a long time, phone still pressed to his ear even after the call ended. The apartment around him felt larger, colder, emptier. He stood slowly and walked to the kitchen. The fridge was nearly empty. He hadn't noticed. Over the next few days, he moved like a shadow. He stopped shaving. He stopped going out. He reread old poetry, trying to find himself in the lines. But the verses felt foreign now, like letters sent to a man who no longer existed. One evening, he sat on the floor of the bedroom, surrounded by unopened mail and unpaid bills. He picked up a folded piece of paper that had slipped between two books, a handwritten note Grace had left on his pillow the week before he left. It read, There's a difference between regret and change. He read it 5 times, then 10, then cried for the first time in months. Meanwhile, in Maplewood, Grace was preparing her front porch for the first frost of the season. She draped warm lights along the banister and brought in the potted herbs she had grown through the fall. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine. Inside, the house was warm, not just from the heater or the spice cider on the stove, but from the feeling that every corner now belonged to her. Emma stopped by with her son, Oliver, who ran into the house as though it were his own. He handed Grace a crumpled leaf and said, "This one's magic." Grace laughed and tucked it into a jar by the window. Later, after Oliver was asleep on the couch, Emma sat beside her mother. "You seem settled," Emma said. Grace nodded. "I'm no longer waiting for the story to fix itself. I'm just writing the next chapter." Emma reached for her hand. "He called me, you know." "Dad." Grace didn't flinch. "What did he say?" "That he was sorry. That he was lost. That Lana left." Grace looked at the fireplace, where a small flame danced. "I'm not surprised," she said quietly. "He asked if you'd ever want to talk." Grace thought for a long moment. "I think I've already said everything I needed to," she said. "He just wasn't ready to hear it before." Emma nodded. Grace continued, "He'll have to build his own peace now. I've started building mine." Thomas visited Maplewood 2 weeks later. He didn't go to the house. He stood across the street, hidden beneath the tall oaks, watching from a distance. The porch lights glowed warmly. Grace sat on a rocking chair, a blanket over her lap, a book in hand. She looked peaceful, whole. He watched her smile at a neighbor walking past. She waved. She laughed. He stood in the shadows, unmoving. She didn't see him, but even if she had, she might not have come and greet him. He turned and walked away. That night, Thomas checked into a modest motel just outside town. He sat by the window with a cup of lukewarm coffee and wrote in the notebook he once thought he'd never use again. He wrote, "I chased youth and found nothing but mirrors. I left love for applause and found silence. Grace, you were the thread I never should have let unravel." He didn't plan to send it, but this time he wrote it for her anyway. And in some small way, it made the hollow space feel slightly less empty. When regret finds you, regret doesn't knock. It seeps in quietly like rain under the door, soft, persistent, and cold. Thomas woke up to the sound of a siren and a dull ache in his chest. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, but the motel room was real. The stiff mattress, the buzzing heater, the cheap curtain that let too much light in, and the pain, real and sharp now. He sat up slowly. His heart pounded unevenly, not with panic but with fatigue. The kind that comes after months of trying to outrun something you should have faced long ago. He reached for the bottle of antacids on the nightstand. Empty. With trembling hands, he got dressed, slipped on his coat, and drove himself to the urgent care clinic near Maplewood's Main Street. The nurse asked routine questions. Age, allergies, recent stress. "Are you under emotional distress, Mr. Thompson?" she asked gently. He looked at her, and something inside him crumbled. "Yes," he whispered. "I think I broke my own life." After a series of tests and a long wait, the doctor confirmed it wasn't a heart attack, just stress, high blood pressure, and exhaustion. "You need rest," the doctor said. "Not just sleep, real rest. Emotional, physical, mental." Thomas nodded slowly. The kind of rest you can't find in a hotel room or at the bottom of an apology. The kind you have to earn. That evening, he returned to his apartment in Seattle. Lana's things were gone. The second bedroom, where she once painted, was empty. Not a single note. Not a forwarding address. Just absence. He stood in the hallway for a long time before walking to the balcony. The sky was heavy with rain. A city full of people moved beneath him, unaware of the man watching them from above, as if through glass. He turned away from the window and picked up his old notebook again. This time, the pen didn't hesitate. He wrote page after page, not poems, not letters, just confessions. Ugly truths, raw memories. How he had abandoned the very woman who had taught him what love looked like when no one was watching. How he had traded history for fantasy, stability for stimulation, depth for sparkle, and lost. A week later, he drove back to Maplewood, not to beg, not to reclaim, but to walk the same streets he had once driven through without looking. He visited the town square, the bookstore Grace used to frequent, the bakery that still made her favorite cinnamon rolls. He bought one, sat on a bench, ate it alone. It didn't taste the same, because she wasn't across the table. Meanwhile, Grace was in her garden, trimming dead branches in preparation for winter. She wore a soft gray sweater and gloves that Emma had knitted for her. The soil was cold, but working with it grounded her. Susan stopped by with a tin of oatmeal cookies. "Look at you," she said, smiling. "You're blooming in November." Grace chuckled. "I'm just pruning what's already done growing." Susan tilted her head. "That's still growth." Inside the house, everything was alive. Books stacked beside the sofa, a kettle steaming on the stove, fresh lavender hanging upside down in the kitchen window, photos of her children, her grandchildren, no photos of Thomas. Not because she hated him, because she had decided her story didn't end with him. Later that evening, she sat by the window, journal in her lap. She wrote, "Forgiveness isn't a door. It's a window. You can let in light without letting someone back in." She paused, then wrote another line. "Regret belongs to the one who turned away, not to the one who stayed." That same night, Thomas stood outside her house. He didn't knock. He didn't expect to be welcomed. He only wanted to see the light in the window. And it was there, soft, golden, steady. He stood under the tree where they once hung wind chimes. The chimes were gone now, replaced by silence. But in that silence, he heard something clearer than any apology he could speak. She was okay. She had survived him. He turned and walked back to his car. And for the first time in a long time, the tears that came didn't ask for anything. They only mourned what had been lost and honored what had remained. Back in the house, Grace made herself a cup of tea. She didn't look out the window. She didn't need to. She already knew the sky sees everything. And sometimes, so do we. Eventually, the sky sees everything. Winter arrived in Maplewood gently that year, not with snowstorms or frozen roads, but with a quiet hush that settled into the bones of the town. The trees stood bare, the fields were pale with frost, and chimneys exhaled smoke into gray skies. It was a season for stillness, and Grace had never felt more alive. She woke each morning before the sun, brewed her tea, and stood at the kitchen window, wrapped in a wool shawl. Outside, the garden slept beneath a thin layer of frost, but she didn't mind. She had come to understand that life has its seasons, times of blooming, times of fading, and times of silent restoration. This was her season of peace. Inside her house, everything had found its rhythm. The warmth was in the colors she had chosen herself. The music was in the way the floor creaked. The comfort was in the knowledge that nothing and no one could shake the ground she had reclaimed. She had not become someone new. She had simply remembered who she was. The trip to Crescent Lake came in mid-December. Emma, Daniel, and the grandchildren all arrived in a flurry of scarves, mittens, and laughter. The rented cabin was nestled between evergreens, its windows fogged with warmth, its porch dusted in snow. The lake beyond shimmered like silver under a pale sun. Grace stood on the back porch with her coat zipped to her chin, mug in hand. Emma joined her. "Thanks for saying yes to this," Emma said. Grace smiled. It was time to make new memories. Later that evening, they decorated a small pine tree inside the cabin. The children hung cookies and cinnamon sticks on its branches. Daniel strung white lights. Grace tied red ribbons. There was laughter, spilled cider, the soft hum of a holiday playlist. At one point, Emma brought out a box of old photos. Not all were happy, but all were honest. They looked at them together. Thomas's face among the memories, frozen in a time before the breaking. Grace didn't look away. Instead, she said, "Let's be grateful that some things happened, even if they didn't last." Meanwhile, in Seattle, Thomas sat alone in his apartment. The couch sagged where Lana used to sit. The bookshelves were still bare. His only company was a new journal, one he now wrote in daily. Not poetry, not fantasy, truth. On Christmas morning, he made himself breakfast. He lit a candle, placed it on the table, and opened Grace's last letter again, the one she had never meant to send but had left behind. He had memorized the words by now. Still, he read them again. "I will not disappear for anyone anymore." There was no bitterness in her handwriting, only clarity. He closed the letter, sat in silence, and whispered to the empty room, "I see you now." Not because he expected her to hear it, but because he needed to say it to release her and himself. Back in Maplewood, the new year arrived with snow. Grace walked to the church alone for the midnight service. The town square sparkled with fairy lights. Bells chimed in the cold air. She sat quietly in the pew, hands folded, and gave thanks, not for a perfect life, but for the strength to grow through an imperfect one. On the way home, she passed the old bench where she and Thomas once shared ice cream. It was covered in snow now. She paused, then kept walking. In the weeks that followed, Grace resumed her rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons at the library, evenings by the fire with a book. She hosted dinners with neighbors, joined a memoir writing group, and once a week taught embroidery at the community center. The town began to know her not just as Thomas's wife, or the quiet woman on Maple Drive, but simply Grace. That name meant something again, and Thomas, far away, still healing, continued writing, continued showing up for his own life. He volunteered at a local shelter, started attending therapy, and once even returned to a poetry reading. Not to read, just to listen. He never remarried. He never moved back. But he made peace with the fact that sometimes you don't get to go home again. Not because the house is gone, but because you've already been given the lesson you came for. Years passed. The garden bloomed again. So did Grace. When she turned 70, Emma threw her a party in the backyard. Neighbors came. Friends brought food. Children ran barefoot in the grass. Grace sat beneath the maple tree with a garland of flowers on her head and a smile that reached all the way into her soul. Someone asked her, "What's your secret?" She said, I stopped waiting for the world to give me light. I learned to thread it through my own life. One night, alone on the porch, Grace looked up at the stars. She thought of the choices made, the love given, the silence endured, the pain survived, and she whispered, not with anger, not with sorrow, just truth. You were wrong about me, Thomas. I didn't disappear. I just changed shape. Above her, the sky stretched wide and open. It saw everything, and it always had. Thank you for staying with us until the final chapter of The Sky Sees Everything. This story wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. It was about rediscovery, quiet strength, and the kind of healing that happens when no one is watching. Sometimes, it's not about who stays or who leaves, but about whether we're willing to stay true to ourselves. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the power of gentle stories, real emotions, and second chances, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Because the sky sees everything. And sometimes it helps us see more clearly too.